The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper, the kind of sterile air that clung to halls where people's fates were decided with the swing of a gavel. Sunlight streamed in weakly through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating dust particles that floated in slow motion, as though even they were waiting to see what would happen. The benches behind the bar were packed that morning. Family members clutched one another in anxious silence, reporters hunched over notepads eager for a headline, and curious onlookers leaned forward, hoping to watch what they believed would be a landmark trial conclude. For them, it was just another story to read about over coffee the next day. For Marcus Taylor, it was his life. At the defendant's table sat Marcus, a 32-year-old man with quiet eyes and a weary frame. His once broad shoulders were hunched inward, as if the weight of weeks in court had physically pressed him down. His wrists bore the sharp bite of cold steel handcuffs, a constant reminder that the system had already decided what he was: dangerous, guilty, disposable. Marcus had been a warehouse worker, known in his community for being dependable, soft-spoken, and endlessly loyal to his family. He was the kind of man neighbors asked for help when their car wouldn't start or when groceries needed lifting. He was a son who called his mother every evening, a brother who helped his younger sister with tuition payments, a man who dreamed of opening his own auto shop one day. Now he sat accused of a crime he hadn't committed, painted by the state as a monster. The charges were brutal: armed robbery and attempted murder. According to the prosecution, Marcus had stormed into a convenience store on a humid summer night, masked and armed, firing a weapon that left the clerk permanently injured. The story was neat packaged and easy for a jury to swallow. But Marcus knew the truth, and the truth had always been murky in this case. No fingerprints connected him to the weapon. The gun recovered was found in an alley 2 miles away, with no physical evidence linking him to it. The grainy surveillance footage captured only the shadowy figure of a man in a hoodie, his face obscured by poor lighting. The only evidence that truly tied Marcus to the crime was the testimony of a frightened eyewitness, a woman who admitted she had seen the perpetrator for mere seconds under stress before identifying Marcus from a lineup that had been poorly arranged. His lawyer had fought, pointing out every inconsistency, highlighting the absence of forensic proof, challenging the reliability of the eyewitness. But Marcus knew how this world worked. He had grown up in neighborhoods where young black men were pulled over for broken taillights that somehow ended with searches, where his friends were handcuffed first and asked questions later, where judges looked down from their benches with eyes that carried centuries of inherited bias. He had always known the deck was stacked, but he hadn't thought it would swallow him whole like this. As he waited for the jury to return, Marcus felt the heavy weight of his mother's gaze on him. She sat in the gallery clutching her worn Bible, whispering prayers under her breath, her lips trembling with each word. The years had carved lines of worry into her face, but her love for him radiated stronger than ever. Beside her was Alicia, his younger sister, gripping a notepad filled with frantic scribbles she had taken during the trial. Her hands shook so violently that the pen had rolled to the floor, forgotten. They had fought for him every step of the way, raising money for his defense, organizing petitions, attending every hearing. But the system had chewed through their efforts like dry paper. Finally, after long hours of waiting, the jury filed back in. The air thickened, the room holding its breath as the foreman stood. He was a middle-aged man with a stern expression, the kind of face that looked carved in stone, immune to empathy. The foreman cleared his throat, unfolded the slip of paper, and spoke the words Marcus would never forget: guilty on all counts. The words didn't just land, they crashed into Marcus like a tidal wave, knocking the air from his lungs. His chest tightened, his stomach dropped, and for a long moment the entire room seemed to spin. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering words meant to comfort him. But Marcus couldn't hear them. They blurred into meaningless noise, drowned out by the thundering realization that his life had just been stolen. Across the room, the prosecutor smirked. He adjusted his tie as though closing this case was nothing more than checking a box, another conviction to add to his record. And on the bench sat Judge William Harris, tall and stiff in his black robe. The judge adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable, his eyes as cold and detached as marble. The sentencing came swiftly, almost as if it had been decided long before the gavel ever struck. Judge Harris's voice was steady, clinical, devoid of humanity as he recited the charges, the statutes, the recommendations. He might as well have been reading from a grocery list. For the crime of armed robbery and attempted murder, this court sentences you, Marcus Taylor, to 60 years in state prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down like a thunderclap, sharp and final, sealing his fate. A sound erupted from the gallery, his mother's wail, raw and piercing, cutting through the solemn air. Her body shook as she clutched her Bible tighter, her sobs echoing against the wooden walls. Alicia dropped her notepad, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She rocked back and forth, disbelief etched into her every movement. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Some spectators gasped, shocked at the severity of the sentence. Others shrugged, indifferent, as though watching another black man's life swallowed by the system was nothing new. Reporters scribbled eagerly, their pens scratching across paper like vultures circling a carcass. For them, it was a headline. For Marcus, it was 60 years of stolen breath. Marcus sat frozen. 60 years. He would be 92 before he ever walked free again, if he survived at all. His dreams evaporated before his eyes. The auto shop he'd always wanted, the family he'd hoped to raise, the quiet afternoons he had promised his mother when he would finally take care of her instead of the other way around. All of it was gone in an instant, devoured by prejudice dressed as justice. Yet even as despair threatened to consume him, a flicker of something burned within. Rage, yes, but also clarity. From the beginning, he had told the truth. I didn't do this. And even if no one in that courtroom believed him, Marcus clung to one certainty: truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. As the guards approached, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, Marcus slowly rose to his feet. He turned his eyes toward Judge Harris. The judge sat with his chin high, his gavel resting in front of him like a badge of unquestionable authority. But Marcus noticed something that others might have missed. Behind the judge's mask of detachment, there was something colder. Not indifference, but disdain. A flicker of prejudice that confirmed what Marcus had suspected all along. It wasn't just justice that had failed him. It was the very humanity of the man in the robe, the man who had never once seen Marcus as innocent. The guards took hold of his arms, the chains rattling as they led him toward the side door. His mother's cries followed him, echoing through the hallways long after he left the courtroom. Each step forward felt like sinking deeper into a shadow he couldn't escape. 60 years stretched before him, a sentence heavy enough to smother the light of hope. What Marcus didn't know, what no one in that courtroom yet realized, was that a single photograph, tucked away in a file, overlooked and forgotten, was waiting to surface. And when it did, Judge Harris's carefully constructed world would tremble beneath him like an earthquake. For now, though, Marcus walked out in shackles, his heart heavy, but his spirit unbroken. Somewhere, deep inside, the ember of truth still burned. The days that followed the sentencing blurred into a monotonous haze for Marcus Taylor. Cold cells, clanging bars, and the endless shuffle of feet on concrete became his new reality. His wrists and ankles remained shackled whenever he was moved, as if he were the dangerous criminal the prosecution had insisted he was. The cell they placed him in was small, the walls chipped and stained by years of despair for men who had occupied it before him. The air carried the metallic tang of iron and the faint stench of mildew. Nights were the hardest, silence punctuated only by distant shouts and the occasional rattle of keys as guards passed. Despite it all, Marcus held onto a stubborn ember of defiance. He replayed the trial over and over in his head, trying to make sense of how truth had been so easily buried. He hadn't fired a gun. He hadn't been at that convenience store. Yet here he was, locked in a cage with 60 years stretching ahead like an endless desert. Still, he clung to the belief that truth had a way of surfacing. Perhaps not tomorrow or next week, but someday, somehow, the lie would unravel. Back outside the prison walls, Alicia refused to let despair take root. Her brother's conviction felt like a blade lodged deep in her chest, but she wasn't about to let the system win. She spent long nights poring over case files, transcripts, and boxes of discovery documents that the defense had barely had time to examine during the rushed trial. Papers were spread across her small apartment, covering the kitchen table, spilling onto the couch, even stacked by her bed. She drank coffee until her hands shook, scoured documents until her eyes burned, and whispered promises to herself that she would find a way. It was during one of those restless nights that she stumbled upon an overlooked folder wedged inside a larger box. The file was thin, almost forgotten, its tab labeled only with the date of the robbery. Alicia flipped it open, expecting to find more useless forms. Instead, a single photograph slipped into her hands. Her breath caught the moment her eyes focused. The image, grainy but clear enough, had been captured by a traffic camera 2 blocks from the convenience store at the exact time of the robbery. It showed a tall, broad-shouldered man walking briskly down the sidewalk, his face partially angled toward the camera. He wore a dark hoodie, matching the description given by the eyewitness. But as Alicia studied the face, her heart pounded. It wasn't Marcus. The differences jumped out at her. The man's nose was straighter, his build bulkier, his jawline sharper. Even more telling was the faint scar above his eyebrow, visible even through the poor resolution. Marcus had no such scar, and in the corner of the image was a timestamp, one Alicia knew well. She had already cross-referenced Marcus's work records from that night. At that exact minute, her brother had been inside the warehouse, clocked in and operating machinery. Her hands trembled as she held the photo closer. It was proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof, that the wrong man had been convicted. She rushed to Marcus's defense attorney the next morning, her eyes red from lack of sleep, but blazing with determination. When she slid the photo across his desk, the lawyer's jaw tightened and his face drained of color. He picked it up, staring for a long moment before muttering under his breath, "This should have been entered into discovery. How did this get buried? This changes everything." Within days, a motion for appeal was filed. The wheels of justice that had once crushed Marcus began to turn in a different direction. But the greatest shock wasn't Marcus's reaction, or even the public outcry that began to stir once word of the photo spread. The real shock came when the image landed in front of Judge William Harris. It was a quiet afternoon in chambers when the folder was presented to him. Harris sat behind his large oak desk, the gavel resting nearby, like a symbol of authority he never questioned. At first, he regarded the photograph with detached interest, flipping it open with the practiced disinterest of a man who had seen 1,000 pieces of evidence. But then his eyes froze. His breath caught ever so slightly, though he masked it quickly with a cough. Because the man in the photo wasn't just a stranger. The man in the hoodie, the one who fit the eyewitness description, the one who had committed the crime for which Marcus had been sentenced, was someone Judge Harris recognized. A distant relative, estranged but unmistakable. The scar above the eyebrow was the final confirmation. Harris's face went pale. His hand trembled as he set the photo down, his carefully constructed mask of authority cracking for the first time in decades. For years, Harris had worn his robe like armor. He believed himself untouchable, a gatekeeper of justice, above reproach. He had sentenced countless men, often with the cold assurance that his word was law. But this single photograph threatened to unravel everything. Not only did it expose a wrongful conviction under his watch, it connected the crime to his own blood. The shame was immediate, searing. His chambers suddenly felt suffocating, the walls pressing in. The gavel on his desk, once a source of pride, now seemed like a heavy weight dragging him toward the abyss. When the appeal hearing commenced, the courtroom was packed again, buzzing with tension. The photograph was presented in open court, projected for everyone to see. Gasps rippled through the audience as the truth unfolded. The image was undeniable, the timeline airtight. Marcus Taylor had been innocent all along. The real perpetrator was out there, free, while an innocent man had nearly been buried alive in prison. Marcus sat at the defense table once again, his posture straighter this time, though his hands trembled slightly on the table's edge. For the first time in months, a fragile hope flickered in his chest. His mother wept openly in the gallery, her Bible clutched to her chest as if it had carried her to this very moment. Alicia gripped her hand tightly, tears streaming down her face, her entire body shaking with relief. Judge Harris, however, looked like a man haunted. His normally stern face was ashen, his hands fidgeting with his robe, his voice noticeably unsteady as he addressed the court. When he granted the motion to overturn Marcus's conviction, his words stumbled as though the weight of what he had done pressed against his throat. Marcus was ordered to be released immediately. The courtroom erupted in a wave of emotion, cheers, sobs, disbelief. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him like a cleansing rain. When the guards removed his shackles, the clatter of the chains hitting the floor echoed louder than the gavel had weeks earlier. He stood slowly, almost disbelieving, before turning toward his family. His mother and sister rushed to him, their arms wrapping around him in an embrace that shook with both relief and grief. Walking out of the courthouse, Marcus felt the sun on his face as though he were stepping into light for the first time. The air tasted sharper, fresher, freer than he could have imagined. Reporters swarmed around him, microphones thrust in his direction, but Marcus ignored them all. He walked straight to his mother and Alicia, his arms still wrapped protectively around them as though they were the only reality that mattered. The system had stolen nearly a year of his life before the truth had surfaced. It had branded him guilty, shackled him, and tried to bury his dreams beneath concrete and steel. Yet it had not stolen his spirit. That ember of defiance he had clung to in the darkest nights had carried him through to this moment of vindication. As for Judge Harris, the photograph lingered in his mind long after the courtroom emptied. It haunted him in his chambers, followed him into restless sleep, and echoed in every gavel strike he delivered afterward. For the first time, he realized justice was not a mask he could wear, nor was authority a shield against truth. His robe no longer felt like armor. It felt like a reminder of the fragility of his judgment, and of how close he had come to destroying an innocent man's life. Though he had sentenced Marcus Taylor to 60 years, it was Judge Harris himself who became imprisoned, not by bars of steel, but by the memory of a single photo that made him go pale.